Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Danish TV's English language TV channel, the global voice of the Center for Islam and Decoloniality. And today we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Loubna Qutami, who's an assistant professor at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, of Asian American Studies, and has been a long time organizer, activist, public intellectual on not just the issue of Palestine, but for the rights of all of the oppressed and indigenous peoples throughout the world. And, it is precisely as I tell my viewership, guests like these that we need to hear more from. We rarely hear about, here in Pakistan, and I dare say even globally, and which is why it is such an incredible delight and honor to have her on the show today. So welcome, Professor Loubna, to the show.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you so much, Professor Junaid, for having me. I'm really honored and enthusiastic to be speaking with you today, even though it has been such a difficult period for Palestinians everywhere, particularly those in the homeland this last month.
Absolutely, absolutely. As I was saying before the show, it's kind of unavoidable to speak about what's actually happened just right now. And again, although nothing new, but it is the latest round of the Israeli reign of terror imposed on the Palestinians. Certainly, I must say that I also wanted to say that I had met Loubna in Turkey, and the inspiration that I received from her beautiful presentation there is one of the reasons why I had to have her on our show. So, and I'm undoubtedly sure that many of us others will be also very much inspired by what she has to say and how to kind of sustain a global solidarity movement with the Palestinians. So, what I wanted to do, Loubna, is talk about two things. One is kind of the early part of your life and growing up as a Palestinian in the United States. What was the larger cultural political milieu that kind of affected your growing up, your youth, and so on, and your own kind of consciousness during that time? How was it developing and how it was evolving, and that led you to do some extraordinary things by the time you became an undergraduate student, and you can talk about some of those things. And then second, in terms of now Dr. Loubna as this brilliant academic, your ongoing kind of efforts, and what you see are the necessities of kind of sustaining a very strong and potent international solidarity movement with the Palestinians. What are some of the challenges and opportunities that we have? So I think if we can cover those two things, would that be okay?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you for the questions.
So yes, let's please start off with.
You're taking me back to my childhood. Yes. as we begin.
Yes.
So, I was born and raised in the United States. My mother is Palestinian, and my father's Jordanian. And I really, to be totally honest, in my early childhood, I was very aware that I was an Arab youth in the United States, and that we were in some ways culturally different from, of course, white Americans, but also that there was a broader lack of understanding about my people and culture and ethnicity amongst the general American public, in a way that even the struggle of other, what's often called minority groups, it wasn't I didn't think of it in the same way, because I still thought that there were representations, at least, of other communities in, in Hollywood and media and so forth, and that there were there was a lot of misinformation about Arab people, for example. But the moment in which that awareness of difference sort of became a stronger political foundation for me was in high school, because that is when September 11th, 2001 happened. And so that was it was really a groundbreaking moment for me, because here I was, an Arab youth in the US that was aware I was different in some ways, but had friends in school, was living a happy life. I don't exactly think of myself as an oppressed person in any particular way, the way that my family had talked about our friends and family back in Jordan or in Palestine, right? So when 9/11 happened, my orientation to what had happened was very different than my classmates, for example. I don't know why, but I was highly desensitized to what had happened that morning. And I was in San Francisco. The events had happened in New York. I went to school, and so many friends were crying, and they were going to cancel school and send everyone home. And I sort of didn't understand the severity. Like it wasn't resonating within me. And I think the reason was, this was September 11, 2001. Palestinians had already been knee deep in the second Intifada, the second uprising for that year. So every morning in my house, our family had just been introduced to Dish Network TV, where we were able to watch Arabic TV. There was all of these new abilities, to find out, to directly have exposure to what was happening in Palestine. So we, as a teenager, I was being exposed to the images of lifeless Palestinian bodies almost every morning before school, and seeing my mom being very upset and very angry and very sad, and my older sister, dragging me out to the rallies. And then, so when 9/11 happened, I didn't understand why that crisis, that tragedy, that catastrophe evoked such wide-scale grief, anger, confusion, crisis among my peers. And so I'd asked sort of...
And the second Intifada began...
Sorry, Junaid, I think I've lost you.
Yeah. Sorry, I was saying, and the second Intifada beginning in 2000. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think I just very naively asked questions like, what happened in New York is very tragic, but also, like, this happens every day across the world. It happens in places like Palestine. The United States has military bases across the entire world. These are things that I learned from my family. We're a family of refugees. We grow up with this knowledge, right?
Right.
But the backlash was really extreme from my peers. And that's when I realized there is a political difference here. There is something about myself, about my people, about my history, about the way that Zionism works in the United States, about the way that the demonization of Arabs or Muslims works in the US, that I need to be politically equipped to speak back to. And so years down the line, when I think back at that moment as like a real formative moment for my entry into political organizing, into a really formative period of consciousness raising in my life, I think of it as a moment in which I was really interrogating questions of the nation state, questions of national belonging, questions of whose life matters and whose lives are always disposable or invisibilized or erased. And the moment that I understood it in that way, all of the other experiences in my own life, in my family's life, and in the world that I was moving, I could only see in that way. I could only see the world through a prism of power and powerlessness, of systemic oppression and people who are oppressed, right?
Right.
And there's just no going back from there.
Moving from just thinking that, well, these people other Americans are just maybe misinformed about us Arabs or us Muslims or us so on or whatever. And if only we can kind of just educate them a little bit better, maybe we'll get a little bit less of the stereotypes in Hollywood, etc. To then getting an understanding of that this is fundamentally politics. It's a political question. It's a question of power. So yeah.
Yeah. I do think that this was really also important for me, not just in terms of understanding the world and how I was moving in it, but
Yeah.
also for understanding my own family and my own community, right? Because
Uh-huh.
before that moment, a lot of the discord in our communities, a lot of the sort of um, maybe unhealthy sets of relationships or values that I don't understand or disagree with. I was just kind of in a way like relegating it to like, oh, this is just our culture or this is just our
Right.
community, right? But once I really understood our communal experience of refugeehood, of trauma, of working class struggle as systemic, I felt like I grew a deep love for my family, for my parents, for how much they sacrificed in their lives, for how much they had been through, and for what our community continues to endure.
Right.
And that was really important, even on a social and emotional scale, not just on an intellectual or political activism level, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely, absolutely, that makes sense, and I think it's then a good segue to that the consciousness that you had developed, and then what you did with that, beginning, I believe, in your undergraduate years with the Palestinian Youth Network.
Yeah. So I do have to say, before I joined the Palestinian Youth Network, I was in the General Union of Palestine Students, and this was the last chapter of the GUPS that was still existing in the United States, because most of the GUPS chapters, GUPS, which used to be the main student union of the PLO,
Yeah.
after the 1993 Oslo Accords, the so-called peace agreements, most of these GUPS chapters had dissolved worldwide.
Mm.
And so this GUPS chapter in San Francisco, in no way affiliated to the PLO or any Palestinian parties, but it still held the name. And so I joined GUPS at SFSU, and really kind of developed more consciousness and more organizing experience through a few different ways. One of which was that by the time I started university, the United States was waging wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So
Yeah.
I was surrounded by a massive anti-war movement that
Right.
that really politicized me in a very strong way. Really gave me the gateway to understanding the history of U.S. imperialism
Right.
across the world. Um, the second Intifada was still unfolding in Palestine, massive uprisings against the Israeli occupation, and then this retaliatory Israeli killing spree that really devastated
Oh,
Palestinians during that period. But the other thing is that in the years that followed the sort of intense 2003, 2004 moment, things sort of started to die down, and
hmm
some of the Palestinian students and I at the university were really thinking, well, what do we do to keep the struggle alive? People aren't coming out to our protests anymore. People aren't coming out to events the way they were in 2003 when the war first started, right? And so we thought about trying to do something that was an affirmation of Palestinian political and cultural history. And so we had this idea of doing an artistic mural on our university campus honoring the late Dr. Edward Said. And
hmm
that mural had a lot of different images in it, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. It had some of his books on there and all these different things. And what surprised us was that there was this incredible Zionist blowback
Wow.
suppression campaign. I think almost like 50,000 emails sent to the university administrators telling them to cancel that mural, and that the Palestinian cultural mural represents a culture of violence and is anti-Semitic and is all of these different things. And what they were hinging their argument on was the refugee right of return key and the image of Handala, which is a little cartoon character drawn by the late Palestinian artist Naji al-Ali,
Yeah.
which sort of signifies the betrayal of the Palestinians by, world leaders, by Arab regimes, by
Yeah.
elite classes, and the protracted experience of refugeehood and occupation of Palestinians. That the child that will never grow old
Right.
until he is able to return to his homeland. Right? They argue that these two images represented a culture of violence, and so that really made me um, hungrier for like justice. It made me
Yeah.
really angry that like this is the least we could be doing right now. This is a
Right.
cultural piece of work that talks about our experience as Palestinians in diaspora, and you are telling us that this is anti-Semitic and and, represents a culture of violence. And so it made me more aware of the way that Zionism in the United States, one of its main goals is to shut down counter-hegemonic narratives of the Palestinian struggle.
Precisely.
Exactly. Right. So that was kind of a forming kind of bridge to the later experience of joining the Palestinian Youth Network, which was, a network of Palestinian young people from across 33 countries worldwide. And what we were finding was that a lot of us, with all of our differences, political, social, gendered, class, like all of religious, like all of these different differences, some of us couldn't even speak the same language, right?
Right.
But what we were finding was that there were common denominators in our experiences as Palestinian young people. The experience of being censored and silenced and repressed in terms of speech or narrative was common for all of us, wherever we were, by state regimes, by academic institutions, by cultural institutions, trying to annihilate Palestinian narratives. That was, for example, one thing that I, coming from the GUPS experience with the mural, really resonated with and realized, wow, this isn't just about SFSU, and it's not just about Edward Said, and it's not just about Hamdallah, and it's not just about San Francisco. This is a quintessential characteristic of the Palestinian experience across the world, right? So that's just one example, I guess I would say.
Right, and then the evolution of the Palestinian Youth Network to the Palestinian Youth Movement. How did that happen?
Yeah, so when we formed the network, it was in 2000, and I joined in 2007, but the network was formed in 2006. And it was really formed by Palestinian youth, both in Palestine and in the Arab region and in different parts of Europe, who were talking to each other saying, we are now, at that time, it was 13 years after the peace process of 1993.
Right.
A Palestinian state was nowhere in sight. The occupation wasn't going anywhere. The settlements were expanding in the West Bank, even though the Palestinians had, for the most part, surrendered their arms and accepted this deal with the Israeli state. Yeah. And, the Intifada, was massive, but resulted in so much destruction of life and land. And so it was a young generation saying, we are not near our freedom. But what now we are also witnessing is a really paralyzing split in national unity between dominant Palestinian parties, Hamas and Fatah specifically, in 2006. And so it was young people saying, we need to get together to think about our future for Palestine. What is the role of young people in a national liberation struggle? What is the role of Palestinians to overcome the fragmentation between Palestinian parties, but also between Palestinian geographies, right? Gaza, separated from the West Bank, Palestinians inside of 1948 Palestine are not in coordination with those in the other occupied territories. And then Palestinian refugees in the camps in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan have no say, in the political.
An element that it is very clear the Israeli state, this fragmentation of the Palestinians has taken advantage of for all these decades.
Yeah,
precisely this, fragmenting the Palestinians from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a quintessential component of their colonial architecture, and I don't mean just like an architecture of the landscape where they've set up all these walls and security outposts and checkpoints and surveillance technologies that separate Palestinians from one another and from their lands. But it's also a psychological architecture, right? That like a Palestinian in the West Bank must resent and be at odds with the Palestinian in the Gaza Strip. A Palestinian in the United States is now an American and completely severed from their responsibility to their people living under occupation in the West Bank. So it's that kind of a very intentional part of the Zionist project. And so, as the PYN, we were really concerned with our leadership isn't getting us anywhere. Young people are not playing the role they used to in the struggle. Our people are fragmented across geography and politics and fighting with each other, forgetting that there's even a colonial apparatus, right? And we're not close to freedom. What does that mean for us? How do we come together as one people defending and protecting a future for a decolonized Palestine. And it was as basic as that. And so the first 5 years of the network were really just experimental. It was us hosting summer camps and conferences to learn about one another, exchange tips on organizing skills, to have really heated arguments about the different ways we saw the struggle. You know, some people see it as an apartheid struggle. Some people see it as a colonial struggle. Some people see it as a religious struggle. Some people see it as a feminist struggle, right?
Right.
We are all different in a lot of ways too, but then trying to identify what brings us together. What are the ways that we can formulate a vision for Palestine that accounts for the disparate, pluralistic Palestinian constituencies of, different geographies, and but also really centers the core goals of our struggle, which is justice, freedom, and refugee return to all of historic Palestine, right? So the network was, I would say, a social experiment. And then by 2011, we really felt ready to be an organization that could articulate a set of political principles of our own, right? That it wasn't just kind of an incubator for Palestinian youth from all these different backgrounds, but that we had finally come to a place where all these different backgrounds could express a shared vision for how we understand the role of youth, a shared vision for how we understand land, a shared vision for how we understand the Arab dimension, especially because 2011 was the start of the Arab uprisings, right? So once we had come to that point, we said, now that we have these visions, our goal is to move together, even though we're in different geographies and going to be doing different kind of activism and organizing. How do we move together? And so that's why we switched to the movement.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm really glad we went over like this period, because I think it demonstrates a real, an evolution of consciousness and strategy, and the strategy amongst Palestinian youth growing up and throughout.
Oh, sorry, Junaid, I think we've lost you.
Okay, you have me back now?
Yeah.
Yeah. And also I was going to say, recognizing how much more it will take, actually, despite all the internal differences that do exist amongst all movements, in this kind of in an anti-colonial setting, but recognizing what it will take, or at least trying to think through what it's going to take for the liberation of Palestine. So, which brings us to now the second part, and to speak about this briefly, although I'd love to go on and on about it with you, because so many insights that you have. But the situation as it stands right now, in terms of, we see the ongoing, and it's very present for us now, the ongoing kind of Zionist terror being unleashed upon the Palestinians, but we also have seen the emergence of an international solidarity movement, which has crucially incorporated the tactic of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, as part of its platform, and which we have actually seen as kind of an incredibly positive development. The also forming the kind of a parallel or analogous situation to what South African apartheid in South Africa, and how to kind of demonstrate the international solidarity to dismantle that regime that existed there as well. So in some ways, I would just like to end by having you give your reflections on where this international solidarity movement is at right now, and I think what you see as the possibilities of its actually, the impact that it will potentially and hopefully have in ameliorating the suffering of the Palestinians.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Junaid. That's such a great question. I think maybe I'll start by talking about the profound opportunities and positive elements of this moment, and then talk a little bit about some of the challenges that international solidarity activists and organizations are experiencing. So the first thing is that what we have seen this last month regarding international solidarity with Palestine is unprecedented. We saw actions in every major city of the world. We saw numbers of protesters come out in much larger numbers than anything we had seen during the 2014 war on Gaza, during the 2018 attack on the Great March of Return protesters, and so forth. We have seen massive institutions, at least in the United States, academic institutions, labor organizations, community-based solidarity, joint struggle groups, release statements and adopt positions on BDS, including groups like the Democratic Socialists of America, which is the largest socialist organization in the United States, who released a very powerful statement, as well as the Movement for Black Lives, for example. However, this moment of opportunity to lift the siege on Palestinian narratives, to lift the censorship on Palestine, for people to be emboldened and courageous enough to come out and speak in support and in solidarity with the Palestinian people, it is already starting to undergo a massive wave of Zionist repression. Right? So there are huge accusations of anti-Semitism that are looming. There are Zionist organizations are hard at work to try to criminalize nonviolent activism, such as engagement in boycott, divestment, and sanctions. They've been doing this for years, at least in the US. Zionists have been pressuring all of the big tech social media companies, Zoom, Facebook, YouTube, Eventbrite, Venmo, Instagram, to censor what is happening in Palestine, right? So this presents a massive level of challenges that the solidarity movement worldwide will experience. And I'm speaking specifically from the US context. But regarding an additional challenge that I think is less talked about, and I think is very, very, very important to sustain the energy of the moment. A lot of international solidarity activists and even Palestinians in the diaspora, we are still using the framework and narratives that we've been using for the last 20 years to talk about Palestine inside. We are talking about the grief, the pain, the suffering, the violence on the Gaza Strip, the siege on the Gaza Strip, the inhumanity, the brutality of the occupation in the West Bank, settlements on the walls, and the harassment and the administrative detention and imprisonment, and all of the things that anyone familiar with the Palestinian struggle is already painfully aware of. Right. But what is very, very important for all of us to remember in this moment is that this has been a moment that Palestinians have been waiting for since 1936. It's the last time we saw a moment like this, where Palestinians in all geographies of historic Palestine, both those in 1948 historic Palestine, in Jerusalem, in the Gaza Strip, and in the West Bank, are saying, we are one people, one struggle, one land. Our struggle is rooted in the 1948 Nakba. It's now time to end the Nakba, and it's now the process in which we are going to attain our final freedom once and for all. All of the struggle in between 1936 and in this moment has been, of course, galvanized international solidarity, but it's always kind of had a center point of a Palestinian community, whether it's the refugee camps in Jordan or in Lebanon or in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank. This is the moment where Palestinians everywhere are rising up saying, freedom is now within our reach. We will refuse. I mean, it's an entirely new psychological orientation to the struggle in this very moment. And so this is why it's being called the Unity Intifada, the Unity Uprising, right? And so I say this because I know that the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip has been reached. We don't know what that will look like, but we know that Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and in Jerusalem are continuously being ethnically cleansed. We know that Palestinians, this week alone, the Israeli state invaded 1,500 homes in a massive arrest campaign called the Law and Order Campaign. We know that the West Bank is continuously vanishing for settlement expansion, and Palestinians are being brutalized, beaten, harassed, imprisoned. And so this is a moment where we as Palestinians really feel 73 years is a day too long,
Yeah.
and it's time to end the Nakba, and we really want to sustain the momentum of this moment to actually think about freedom as a very practical goal. It's
Right.
not,
Right.
there's something inside of us that believes at this moment that it's the only option for us and for the world. And there's a commitment to that process to attain a very practical, pragmatic, and achievable freedom.
Absolutely. I think you put that so well that it really does seem like, and again, this is not to deny the horrific and tragic state. I mean, since the many decades, and of course over the past few weeks, what has happened and the lives lost and the ongoing ethnic cleansing. But as we mentioned before, the key element that Israel has always relied on is trying to fragment these Palestinian populations from one another. And what happened now, which was, as you pointed, I'm so glad you pointed this out, is that it's so significant that, the way the Israelis would like to portray, okay, well, the Palestinians in Israel are relatively better off than the Palestinians in the West Bank, which are relatively better off. This is all collapsed. They have become one. That the Palestinians in Gaza, when they were hearing about what's going on in Al Jara and Al Aqsa, etc., the Palestinians in East Jerusalem wanted them to respond, and they did respond. And so this type of unity, whereas before, as you were saying, the type of the manufacturing and engineering of that type of factionalism, particularly around Hamas and Fatah in 2006, etc., all of this seems to be now being overcome by a deep impulse amongst ordinary Palestinians to be united in this. And along with kind of, you see, I mean, it's very difficult now for the Zionists to cover up what it's doing. And so I really do think that you ended on a note which is not just to say that, okay, yeah, let's end on a positive note, but something that is actually very true. That this the ideals of freedom and justice, actually, that of course we've had all along, but always knew in our head that it's so difficult. The psychological barriers that kind of we that were there, not just self-imposed, but that really did exist in confronting this behemoth, violent state. But at this point, a lot of those psychological barriers have been dispensed with, because we have seen that a unified Palestinian people will continue to resist and are not going anywhere. And I think the Israelis know that, and the world knows that now as well. And so now we can just hope and pray that, inshallah, that those ideals are achieved soon. Loubna, I would love to speak more with you, but so that people watch the show, and not just end it at 5 minutes or something. Unfortunately, we have to end it now. But I wanted to thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
coming
Thank
on.
you. I really appreciate being in conversation with you. And I'm extending so much appreciation and love to all of the people in Pakistan who came out into the streets in large numbers this last couple weeks. And to all of the viewers, thank you for your ongoing solidarity and support for Palestine and the Palestinian struggle.
Folks, that was Dr. Loubna Qutami, and a pure delight to have her on. Thank you so much, Loubna. Take care.